Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. So good morning, everybody. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Thank you for joining us for this month's Roundtable. I'm Gail Fagan, the Program Manager for Research Development and Manager of the monthly OSP Roundtables. Before we get started, just a couple housekeeping items. So please remember these presentations are recorded and posted on the website for public access. Therefore, we'd like to ask that you turn off your camera and mute yourself. If you have questions during the presentation, please use the chat or raise your hand functions. I have a list of everyone who has sent me an email this far for RACP credit. If you haven't done so already, please send me an email sometime today. And then before we get started with today's presentation on prior approval, Sarah from Export Controls is going to take a couple minutes to talk to us about the recent Russia sanctions. And then after she's done, Liz will start her presentation. So Sarah, you can go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Gail. Good morning, everyone. And like Gail mentioned, I'm just going to take a couple minutes here and then you'll be on to your regularly scheduled program. But my name is Sarah Schlechter. I'm Cornell's Export Control and Compliance Officer. And I wanted to get in front of you guys for just a few minutes today to talk about what's happening with the Russia-Ukraine situation. As you may or may not have read in the news that there are a lot of things going on with Russia. So our government has tried to sanction Russia, is sanctioning Russia for a lot of the actions and attacks that they've made against Ukraine. So what does that mean for us at Cornell? So if you can see my slide here, I just have one slide. So this is really what it means for us. These are the really big sanctions and restrictions that have come out. Export and re-export restrictions. So the U.S. Department of Commerce has announced a sweeping set of restrictions on exports and re-exports for any sort of items intended for Russia. And I won't get into the nitty-gritty details here, but what you guys need to know is that you probably are not going to be able to ship anything to Russia right now. But if you have something that absolutely has to go to Russia, come to myself or my colleague Terrence, and we can talk about it with you. But like I said, it's very, very restrictive right now, and it's going to be virtually impossible. Not to mention a lot of your major shipping carriers, FedEx, DHL are not even servicing Russia at the moment. And that likely goes for Belarus as well, even though I can say in my 7 years at Cornell, I've never had anyone want to send something to Belarus, but it could happen. And then what about Ukraine? So there are 3 areas of Ukraine that identify under Russian control. So they're Russian controlled regions of Ukraine, and that's the DNR and LNR regions, and then the Crimea regions. So these 3 regions of Ukraine are what we call comprehensively sanctioned. And that means we cannot do basically anything with these 3 regions of Ukraine. That would even include something like fundamental research. We just cannot work with these 3 regions. So again, the DNR and the LNR are in the the eastern region of Ukraine, then Crimea is on the far south of the Ukraine, and they're comprehensively sanctioned. They're under Russian authority, and we cannot do anything with those regions. And then finally, and this is what I'm finding is the biggest issue for Cornell, there have been a number of financial and banking restrictions announced against Russia and Belarus. So they started out by saying you can't send payments to a lot of the major banks in Russia. But just on March 11th, President Biden issued a new executive order that virtually prohibits all payments going into Russia. And in fact, the order says it prohibits any payment made to anyone within Russia. So it doesn't matter if they're a Russian citizen or a citizen of France or UK. If they're in Russia, you cannot make a payment to them. That includes a bank transfer, a wire transfer, a check, anything. No money can go into Russia. So the message here is just if there's a transaction with Russia, Ukraine, or Belarus, just come to myself or come to my colleague Terrence, and we will talk you guys through that right now. And that's all I really want you guys to know. You don't need to be an expert in these sanctions. You just need to know to come to us if they do come up in your everyday lives. And I know a lot of you work, well, obviously most of you work in research or research administration. So you're going to see a couple little updates in RAS on the foreign activities question. We have added Russia and Belarus and all of Ukraine. So if there is any activity with any of these regions, you'll be checking that off in RAS. We've also added it to the IRB part of RAS. Our controller DFA has been notified, travel registry. So there are a lot of internal controls that we put in place to deal with this. So if you see that stuff come up, just know that's why we're doing it. Okay, and that's all I really had. Again, you can reach out to myself. You can reach out to my associate Terrence. There's a general export controls mailbox, and all of this is on our website as well. So our contact information and everything along those lines. So feel free to reach out to us anytime. Okay, so, and that's all I have. So I'm going to turn it back over to Liz, and thank you for letting me interrupt your program for a few minutes. Let me stop screen.
Sarah.
Sorry, my goodness gracious, my Zoom is freaking out. Okay, so can everyone see this screen? Cool, perfect. No inquiries. So my name is Liz Grinstead. I'm a grant and contract officer in the Office of Sponsored Programs. I'm on the New York State and Foundations team, and I'm going to be talking to you about prior approvals for federal grants. So I actually have a pretty big background in NIH and the federal side from my time at Colorado State University. So even though I'm on the Fed, or I'm on a non-Fed team, I still have some Fed background. So first is the definition of prior. So prior means before. Here's some synonyms: preceding, previous, ahead, before. When we're asking for prior approval, we're asking before any action happens. So what about post prior approval? So you already asked, or you already did the thing, whatever it may be, and you didn't get permission. Can I have post prior approval? Well, post prior approval doesn't exist. That's asking for forgiveness. There is no such thing as post prior approval. We are just going to go back to the sponsor and essentially be like, I'm sorry, I did this thing. Will you approve it? And they can say no. They are contractually within their rights to say no to anything that we did that requires prior approval that we did not get before. So it does become a big risk on your department, on your funds, on your project, just depending on what you did that you're asking for forgiveness for. So prior approval is really important. So when do you not need prior approval? This is a great question and one that comes up a lot. So the best thing to do is to read the award terms and conditions of your grant, of your cooperative agreement, maybe of your contract. That's going to get a little dicey though, and see what you are allowed to do. So there's a bunch of resources that the feds put out there. There's a prior approval matrix that NSF has posted. I have a hyperlink up there. Uniform guidance, knowing your sponsor and looking at the agreement. So the feds are authorized under uniform guidance to waive prior approval for certain items. A lot of these things are going to happen under expanded authorities and the FDP, Federal Demonstration Partnership. So the three big ones are 90 days pre-award spending, a one-time no-cost extension initiated by us, the grantee, and carry forward of unobligated funds into subsequent periods. And we're going to go in detail to all those, but those are the big three that we can get into without needing prior approval that are sometimes typically needed. And that's only for certain sponsors, and that's only if the agreement allows. So always make sure that you're reading your agreement. So expanded authorities and FDP, why are these two things separate, and why do we talk about them so much? So FDP came out of Florida. Actually, it was originally like the Florida Demonstration Partnership, and then it became the Federal Demonstration Partnership. And it was a group of universities and institutions that came together to really bring together research, standard terms and conditions, the ability to contract and subcontract with each other, and have these things that they were low risk, so the feds could flow terms down to them, and that university to like a sub-university can flow things to each other as well. It's also a clearinghouse for a lot of things, for a lot of documents when you work with the sub-award team. It's just a really great thing, but it's not all federal agencies. It's just this list on here that I have with NSF, NIH, Department of Energy, USDA, NIFA, Department of Commerce, and NASA. You need to know, if the prior approval waived from the last slide, those big three, are waived in your award, and they will be unless it's otherwise stated, and it will be called out, it'll be explicit. So expanded authorities is slightly different. So expanded authorities came out of the success of everyone partnering together for FDP. And it's written now into uniform guidance. It's the default research terms and conditions, and it applies to all federal research assistance award, again, unless otherwise stated. It will stay explicitly like this is not subject to expanded authorities. A lot of times it's going to come under cooperative agreements and maybe your more restrictive grants. But again, it's those three big areas: the pre-award, the first no cost extension request as initiated by the grantee, and carry forward. So if you have questions, always start at the top of your order of precedence, and that's going to be your award terms and conditions. That's going to give you the most restrictive information. So start there and then flow down from there if you can't find the answer. So generally, what needs prior approval? And we're gonna look at uniform guidance to talk about prior approval and what we need and when we need to go to the feds. So there's a lot that needs prior approval, as you can tell. If I can count Roman numerals right, there's 8 big things that we're gonna talk about when it comes to prior approval. And again, prior means before. So don't do the action, ask permission first, loop in your GCO, loop in your federal programmatic officer and everything. They can't give the authority, but they're a good resource to even see if something would be like considered, if it is like a little sketch. So we're going to go through as much as possible, as quickly as possible, these common sort of processes for our prior approval requests alphabetically. So first, Cornell process: whenever you're making a prior approval request, enter that into RAS under the amendment / request award amendment action. That way it shows up in your GCO's workflow. The GCO gets that great automatic email, and then we can ask questions and make sure we're doing all the right things. And then the GCO can review to see if it does need the prior approval or if something that we are covered under expanded authorities or under the agreement. But always put it in there. It makes the GCO's lives a lot easier, especially for workflow tracking. Plus, then you can track it as well. So budget revision. So when we're talking about moving between direct cost categories or indirect cost categories, we're talking about moving from like a personnel to like an other direct line. The feds restrict how much money you can move generally. And per uniform guidance, if it exceeds or expected to exceed 10% of the total budget, you need prior approval. So that's not always the case. So with expended authorities, among direct cost categories only, if it exceeds 10%, you probably don't need prior approval. If it's not under expanded authorities or FDP and it exceeds 10%, you do need prior approval. Again, look at your agreement. And when you do need to request prior approval on a budget revision, you need to provide to your GCO, provide to the sponsor, a revised budget and a justification. And that justification is not only a budget justification, but a justification on why you need to move the funds between the cost categories. So at time of proposal, it's our best estimate, is our best guess of what our needs are. When we get to award stage, maybe we're in year 3 and we lose a postdoc and we need to move that from personnel into services so we can, use an outside vendor or consultant, and it exceeds 10% of the total budget. We just need to, make the case for that prior approval to move the budget from personnel into other direct. And I do have my chat function. So if there are any questions, post them in chat and someone interrupt me. So for NIH, significant rebudgeting is seen as 25% more of the total costs awarded. So this could be a potential change in scope by NIH, and it needs more review by your GCO. So if you're moving a good chunk of money from between budget categories, NIH has a bigger threshold. Just want to make sure that we get a GCO to review first, make sure it's within that budget category. And it's not just a one-time move, it is aggregate. So let's say you move like 5,000 here, 10,000 here, over the course of the project. If it eventually ends up at that 10% or that 25%, we need to ask for prior approval on whatever that last thing is, and then kind of explain what we've done so far. So it's not just every time, it's once we hit that 25, once we hit that 10 or over. But significant rebudgeting does not apply to modular grants. And that is because modular grants, we are not giving a detailed budget. So there's a lot of things that we give ourselves a detailed budget to make sure that we're within our modules, that we're within, that we're not, spending crazy and inappropriately, and everything's, allowable, allocable, auditable. But for the feds, the modular grants, kind of a free for all, not really, but it's like they don't care between the modules because they're just giving us a lump sum of money and are expecting us to be good stewards of those funds. So carry forward. So carry forward is moving funds from one budget period to another budget period. So if you have a 5-year budget and you spend like 95% of that budget in year 1, that remaining 5%, if we have carry forward, can be moved from year 1 into year 2, so we don't lose those funds. So under FDP, automatic carry forward. We don't have to worry about reporting back to the feds how much we have unobligated, how much we haven't spent, and moving those funds into the next period. Not under FDP, we have to have prior written approval. It's usually after the 425, the federal financial report is submitted. That way the feds have captured, or we've reported to the feds rather, how much money that we've obligated, how much has been de-obligated, what's sort of in our restricted funding where we're saying that, this is already tied up money, we're just waiting for these bills to come through. And we need to ask for permission from our sponsor to move those funds from one year to the next. This will be included the amount of funds that we need to carry forward, why we were unable to spend during that project or that budget period, a detailed budget on what we're going to do with those funds, and then a scientific justification. So 4 things for this. A lot of times if our carry forward balance is too large, they might reduce our next year's budget to accommodate for that because the feds only have so much money. And if we only spent 50,000 out of 100,000, first they're going to question to even make sure that the project is going smoothly scientifically and there's not any big hiccups like why did you ask for this much money and you've only spent half of it. And then they were within their rights to reduce year 2's award by $50,000, by $25,000, and have us move that money into the next budget period, maybe with a loss. So next one is a change. So this is going to be a replacement in the principal investigator. So there's also a disengagement. We're going to get that later down the road, down the alphabet when we get there. But this is actually if we're changing the principal investigator or a key person. So again, PI, co-I, key person, anyone who is named in the application and named in the award we're saying that they are a significant scientific contributor and the work cannot be performed without them. So if they leave, how are we supposed to continue the work? So every Fed agency under FDP has not waived automatic prior approval under this. So we always have to ask for prior approval if a PI, co-I, key person leaves the project for whatever reason. So including on the request, they want to see the CV or resume of the person who we're going to be replacing them. And they want to know why, or like how and why they're going to be able to fulfill the role. So a really common one for this one is if a PI leaves an institution. Actually, that's a bad example. I'm sorry. That's a whole nother story. The common one for this, if a co-I retires. So say your co-I retires, there's someone else who's coming up in the ranks who, has been their like protege, has been, being groomed by this person. Just want to make sure that we're saying, hey, Dr. So-and-so retired, but Dr. Blue is coming up. They're great. Here's their CV. Here's how they can fulfill a role. Here's how they've already been working on this project, or here's their expertise. That's why it is so important that we only name people who are necessary and needed on the project to be named in the proposal and in the agreement. So not naming your GRAs, not naming your postdocs, not naming people who are coming in and out of the lab as flux. They might be really important to the overall overall project, and they can still be named on publications so that the grads can get, their check marks on getting like publications. There's no publish or perish restrictions with the PI, co-PI key person. It's just preventing asking for prior approval when someone leaves. Oops. Next slide. There we go. Change in cost share. So on the rare occasion that we have to provide cost share to the feds, if you're changing the amount or where it's coming from, or the budget on which you are providing cost share, you have to get prior approval. So a lot of USDA grants actually and cooperative agreements have cost share as a part of the requirement. Forest Service especially has like 20% minimum a lot of the time. NIFA does. Most of your USDAs have a cost share component. So when you're cost sharing, make sure you're capturing what you are able to cost share appropriately. One of my favorite things to do to tell people with cost share is just like, don't cost share. If we don't have to cost share, just don't cost share. That's a whole other presentation. The answer is no on cost share unless it's absolutely required. So when you have to do that requirement for cost share, when you have to put that into your proposal, into your agreement, making sure that you have those things secured. So it has to be, cost share has to be expended during the life of the agreement. It has to be within the guidelines of, what is allowable on the grant, on the project, and we have to track it. So if we can't do those three things, it's probably not a good cost share source. So one of the examples I have for this one is that I had a PI back at CSU who wanted to cost share, and they had this great project that was coming up. Never got funded, and they were out like $50,000 in cost share because they were expecting this, other agreement to come through to cost share. So we had to go back, find some money. They had to actually dig into their startup account back at CSU in order to cover the cost share. So make sure the project that you're cost sharing, if it is another sponsored project, is in the same project period, or at least overlaps enough with the amount that overlaps enough for the cost share. So for the prior approval matrix, only NASA and USDA NIFA have waived the prior approval. USDA NIFA, except when it's a reduction in the amount of cost sharing. Otherwise, prior approval is needed. The rest of the agencies that participate in FDP all require prior approval. No cost extensions. All right, this is the most common prior approval request that I think everyone gets. We need more time, especially around COVID. I think like the past 2 years, I've done more no cost extensions than I've done anything else, just because COVID hit, labs shut down, people went to 25%, 50% of the lab staff. We just need more time. Shipping was a nightmare. All good things. So for in uniform guidance with those agencies that are under uniform guidance and agree to these FDP expanded authorities terms and conditions, we can request and initiate that one-time up to 12-month no cost extension and just basically notify the feds that we are taking it. This is not to be used just because you have funds remaining. There must be a scientific reason why we need a no cost extension. Again, PIs cannot use this just for spend down. That is not a valid reason. And when you're putting your request into RAS on that amendment request, it does ask for a paragraph. If you don't put any sort of information on why the no cost extension is needed, your GCO would come back and be like, hey, tell me why. We need to have a justification for this. We need, on whatever sponsor, we always need a justification on why more time is needed. And if the PI is like, yeah, I just need to spend more money, absolutely not. No, that's not a valid reason. The feds will throw it out. They will not look at it. They will say, no, that is not a valid reason. So when do we need prior approval from the feds when they are under this? So if the terms explicitly say no extensions, obviously we can still ask. There's sometimes no harm in asking. There sometimes is harm in asking, but we can ask and see what happens, especially when we're in pandemic season. There's a lot of times where we can ask and get that approved. If the extension requires additional funds, that is a separate request. That is not a no cost extension. That is a cost extension. It's usually seen as supplemental funding. Or if the extension involves changes in the approved objectives or the scope of work. So if the extension is significantly changing the scope of work, that is not the same as a no cost extension as well. So no cost extensions for those under FDP, first time no cost extension up to 12 months, automatic approval. So for those who work in NIH, it's like literally the easiest thing. Same with NSF. You basically go in, you go into like amendment request, you say, I want a no cost extension. You put in how much time you need, you put in a little justification, you hit submit, and then an automatic notification comes through your email saying, hey, you're approved. So easy. Love it. Love the Fed system sometimes. Some are a little bit longer where you have to actually craft the email and send it off. And some people want like a letter on, letterhead and all that good stuff. For the most part, it must be submitted at 10 days before the current end date. If you're after that 10 days, again, they are contractually, within their rights to deny that request. Any second no cost extensions, you have to have approval from any feds for a second no cost extension. And those actually take a lot more information in order to get a second no cost extension. So when you're asking for a no cost extension, always try to ask for the maximum amount of time. It helps prevent a no cost or a second no cost, I'm sorry. So say your PI is like, I think I need like 6 months, maybe 8, ask for 12. There's not a penalty for ending early. We just want to make sure that we are not in danger of having to ask for a second NCE and then provide all this additional justification, because once totally approved, second, they're going to look at that and say, hey, why is this not progressing? Like, we gave you another year, we gave you another 6 months, you said that's all you needed. Why is this no longer what you need? For those not under FDP, you have to submit it to the administrative contact at the feds, right? Your sponsor. Program officers, no, they do not have the ability to approve anything. They're great resources for technical stuff. They're great to see like the pulse and where things are at. They can't approve anything. If your PI forwards you from their program officer like an approval saying, hey, yeah, your no cost extension is approved, can't use that. Got to get it from the grants management specialist, the GMO, the GMS, whoever is the federal admin contact within your agreement. So it could be like contract officer, grant management specialist, grant management operator, any of those great titles from the feds. That's who you need the approval from. So with this, you need a length of the time requested. So whether it's like a 6-month request, a 12-month request, an 18-month request. I usually, whenever I craft mine, I like to do like Cornell formally requests a 6-month no cost extension with a new end date of blah, blah, blah. And that way it's very clear on how much time and what we want the new end date to be, so other people don't have to do date math. I like to make it as explicit as possible when I'm asking. A justification for the additional time, again, scientific justification for more time. Spending down funds, no. Saying that, yeah, because of the pandemic, all of our samples were stuck in another country and were unable to get shipped to us. Totally a valid reason. We'll ask for a no cost extension for that. And then sometimes some agencies want to see how the budget will be used. So you have to provide how much budget you have remaining and how it will be used during that no cost extension period. Again, if you're under, if your agreement is not under FDP, loop in your GCO early and often just to make sure you get all the right materials, all the right information. And it's going to be lined out in your agreement. It's also going to be lined out on your sponsor's terms and conditions websites. Participant support cost transfers. So participant support, if you have an agreement with participant support, you know how fun it is. So prior approval is required if there's a transfer of funds budgeted for participant support. It's usually not into participant support, it's usually out of participant support. So NSF, DOE, NIFA, and DOC all require prior approval to transfer funds for participant support from participant support out to other categories. NSF is a great one because they're super sticky on it and it's really hard to get prior approval on transferring funds out of participant support costs. One of my colleagues back at CSU, when she was at another institution, they put all these costs in participant supports because that's where the PI said, oh yeah, all these are for participants, they're all for the trainees. Turns out they weren't. And they asked NSF if they could move them out. And if NSF said no, because they were so excited about how many funds were in participant support and how much support the trainees were going to have and all those great things that they were doing. So you really have to have a good reason besides, whoops, we made a mistake. Not really a good reason, but you really need to have that good reason on why you're moving funds out of participant support. NIH and NASA, they don't require prior approval unless it is a change in scope. Pre-award costs. So we have the ability on those under FDP, under expanded authorities, to spend funds 90 days before the award period of performance. So say your agreement starts on April 1. You can expend 3 months before that to start incurring project charges. This doesn't mean that you can really start working on the project 3 months before, but it means you can start spending those funds. Really great examples of that is, equipment purchases that we need to get into the lab to start on day 1, especially if there's, discounts and stuff with buying equipment and everything. Another one is getting the service contracts set up, making sure we get all that taken care of with procurement, so our service providers, can start on day 1, ordering in materials and supplies. It's really not meant to be for personnel to start early. It's really meant to be so you can collect all the things that you need to start on day 1 of that project. However, any costs incurred before the federal awarding agencies makes that award, before you have that fully executed award in hand, is at our own risk. So anything that we spend before we have, the agreement in hand, we're doing it at risk. Something could happen when we don't have a fully executed agreement and something falls through, and then we're stuck eating those costs. So, really make sure you're confident on your agreement. Really assess the risk versus reward when you are doing pre-award spending. So pre-award costs, again, under FDP, automatic approval, up to 90 days before the agreement. If it's more than 90 days, you have to get prior approval from the agency. Not under FDP, not written into the agreement. You always have to get prior approval to spend costs before the start date, and requires justification on why whatever items, whatever expenses you have need to be purchased before the start date. Again, the equipment, the materials and supplies, and setting up consultation agreements, I've had no problems with getting those set up, especially if it has a cost savings to the feds. So PI takes a long break. So this is disengagement and reduction in effort, which is different from someone leaving the project. So if there is disengagement from the PI, so if the PI is no longer working on the project or is reducing their effort by 25% of what they've committed, prior approval is required. No agencies have waived prior approval. NSF and NASA require the same for any PIs, co-PIs, or co-PDs. Co-PD and PD really mean the same thing for NSF. NIH also requires anybody who is named on the notice of award. So if you see an NIH award, it lists out on the cover page like who the PI is, and generally in section 4, special terms and conditions, it'll list anyone else they say is a key person and is named on the notice of award. Scope of work change. So we need prior approval if there's a change in scope. So if the project is changing significantly, if the objective has changed, if the what they were doing takes like a left turn and cool science things are happening, and it's really outside of what they proposed, we just need to notify them and get prior approval that this is the direction that the feds still want to support. So NIH has defined what constitutes a change in scope. A lot of agencies haven't. So it's really, your PI knows best if something's different. Most of us are not have the major science PhD backgrounds that are, and we're supporting and we love what they do, but it goes whoop right over our head. So the PI is going to be your best person on this, and your PI and programmatic officer should be talking already. If there are cool new discoveries, it should be reported within their technical reports, all that good stuff. So if your PI comes to you and be like, hey, this is completely out of left field, we really want to explore this, that should send a signal up being like, hey, this probably needs prior approval. So NIH has a great definition of change in scope. And so there's a whole list here of potential changes in scope. If you work with NIH, One, you should have the GPS grant, NIH grants policy statement bookmarked, and two, you should have this specific 8.1.2.5 bookmarked. So I'm not going to read this to you, but prior approval is required by NIH, by the awarding institute for these potential changes in scope, which include the change of like specific aims, significant rebudgeting, and purchase of a unit of equipment exceeding 25,000 that was not originally budgeted. So those are the big three that kind of come into. So especially the significant rebudgeting and the equipment. NSF change of scope is a little bit more loosey-goosey. And they're just saying you cannot change without prior approval of NSF. So it's outside, what your proposal was. You got to talk to NSF for those changes in scope, but it's not as defined as what the change in scope is. So if you don't have the PAPPG bookmarked for NSF and you're NSF heavy, go now and bookmark it. It is your friend and it's searchable and it's lovely. Adding subawards. So our subaward team would love me to, I think, emphasize all of this. So prior approval is required if we're adding a subaward after proposal. If the subaward's in the proposal, great. We just have to remember our change in budget and change in scope in order to move money, in order to move, work over to them, seeing what's appropriate there. If we are adding a new subaward after the agreement, we got to get prior approval for the most part. So make sure you name all your subs in the proposal. And if you have a high risk sub, you got to talk to your GCO and they will loop in the subaward team. Our subaward team is wonderful and they will answer your questions. So adding subawards. So NIH, NIFA, NASA have all waived prior approval for subawarding, adding subawards after the fact, except NIH has waived it unless it is a foreign sub or a change in scope. So for NIH, any contracting, subawarding, consulting agreements, service agreements, all that good stuff with a foreign entity must get prior approval. The NIH, if you don't put it in your proposal and they don't sign off on it, and you want to add a foreign component after the award has been made, no matter what kind of foreign component it is, we have to get prior approval. So any foreign component, NIH, after the fact, loop in your GCO, tag them immediately. Jamie is a great resource for all of that. NIFA has waived except for these 2 points. Excuse me, if it's going to be more than 50% of the total agreement, or if the subaward is to a federal agency, those times prior approval is needed. NSF, DOE, and DOC require prior approval no matter what. If you want to add a fixed price subaward, so most subawards are cost reimbursable, like most of our grant and cooperative agreements, so we flow down the same terms and conditions to them. We can do fixed price subawards. Oftentimes it's for higher risk subs or those who need maybe more cash up front because they're in like Nepal or they're in an African country where you have to have cash on hand in order to do anything. Or they're a higher risk. And so we just need to track their progress a little bit more, and receipts may be a little more challenging with their financial systems. So all FDP agencies require prior approval to issue as fixed price. And we need a specific deliverable milestone schedule. We need the scope of work schedule that all encompasses that, and we need a budget. And if you're wanting to do a fixed price subaward, got to talk to OSP first. They will walk you through, we will walk you through, with the GCOs and the subaward team both will walk you through how we need to go about getting that and what we need. It looks like there's some things in chat. I will get to a couple of these questions at the end. So Cornell process, again, what we need to send to sponsor is not the same thing that OSP needs. OSP needs more. So to send for the scope, to send to add subawards to the sponsor, we need the sub scope, sub budget, and budget justification, why we need that subaward, and an updated Cornell budget to show where those funds are coming from our budget into the subs. It's going to be a two-step process in RAS. The first is going to be an amendment request under whatever the main award is. And then the second is going to be creating that sub-award as well. So it's 2 steps in RAS once we get there. So 1, we need that first step so we can ask for prior approval. 2, we need the sub-award set up so the sub-team can do their thing. So OSP also needs, in addition to those 4 things, the sub-commitment form, whether that's an FDP sub-commitment form or, like the letter of intent and all that good stuff, or if it's like the specific Cornell sub form, and the sub-award budget justification, and scope of work. Got to have all those things, or else we can't issue a sub-agreement. I have the CU sub-awards email on there. Ask them any questions. So in summary, to wrap up, prior written approval, we need to get prior approval for a lot of actions. How am I doing on time? I'm doing great on time. So we need to make sure that not only prior approval is for those things that are allowable, allocable, and auditable, we need to make sure that we're asking the right people the right things in order to get this prior approval, especially if there's unusual costs, if we're doing something funky. If you're really in doubt, ask your GCO, and if your GCO is in doubt and they've exhausted their internal resources, we go to the feds, we go to our sponsor and be like, hey, this is our situation. How does this sound? And that way, when we ask for prior approval and they say yes, we have that firm documentation. We have that if we ever get audited and say, hey, we asked for it, it was approved, so we went with it. And it's approved by the right people. So I just have a few pop quizzes. So if people want to unmute and shout out answers or put them in chat, please do so. Feel free to unmute and shout out answers. So the first one, the question is, Dr. Blue has an NIH R01 grant that was proposed and awarded as a modular budget. Dr. Blue wants to purchase a piece of equipment for $15,000 in year 2 of their 5-year grant. This was not proposed originally. Do you need prior approval from NIH for this equipment purchase? Yes or no?
Nope.
All right, I've seen some no's, hearing some no's. Great. Yes, the answer is no. Why can't it click? Click. No prior approval needed. Why? Equipment purchases over $25,000 need prior approval as defined this as a change in scope, but this is a modular budget. So we don't need prior approval for that. But since it also includes equipment, just sort of a quick throwing things out there for you. All right, next one. Dr. Orange has an NIH grant, is in year 3 of the project. Budget is about $350 per year, and it's not a modular budget. Dr. Orange is needing to transfer $100,000 from materials and supplies to other direct to cover an unforeseen expense. The NIH programmatic contact has already said it's fine. Do we need prior approval?
Yeah.
Brian says yes. Christine says yes. Yes, 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 yes. Answer is yes. So why this falls into the NIH significant rebudgeting, where we're increasing or decreasing by 25%. So again, NIH has that 25% limit versus the 10% limit. Is prior approval by the programmatic contact sufficient? Yes or no? I have 1 no, 2 no, 3 no. No, this needs to come from your grant management specialist. The programmatic contact is great for the technical stuff, has no authority on changing anything in the project. Great job. All right, another one. So Dr. Maple has a $200,000 grant from USDA Forest Service in which expanded authority applies, but FDP does not. Dr. Maple wants to move $35,000 of their other direct costs budget to personnel in order to add a couple of GRAs for the summer. Do we need prior approval?
Yeah.
I have a no question mark. I have a yeah, maybe with a question mark. I have a yes. Yes, we do need prior approval. Anyone want to stab at why before I show the answer?
It's over the 10% threshold.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes, this is over 10% of the awarded budget. All right, Dr. Green has named their GRA Julio as a COI on their NSF 5-year grant proposal and refused to submit. Yes, math is always fun. Refused to submit this without Julio being named as COI. Happily, this proposal was accepted, and Dr. Green's, Hemlock, and Julio are all key persons. Julio is leaving Cornell next year. You drove the grant for a European hiking adventure through the Alps, woohoo, and will not be turning to Cornell. Julio will be replaced by an assistant professor at Cornell for the remainder of the project. Is prior approval needed?
Yes.
Excellent. Yes. Why? It's because Julio is named as key personnel and we have to get a prior approval for change of key person. Again, love GRAs, don't name them as key personnel. This happens all the time. GRAs graduate, they move on, they drop out, they go on through the Alps and decide to become a goat farmer. All good things, doesn't help us when we have to get prior approval. All right, Dr. Purple has a 3-year NASA grant. They're wanting to use the unspent funds in year 1, about $55K in the year 2 budget. This award has no exceptions to FDP or expanded authorities. Do we need prior approval?
No.
I'm hearing some no's, I'm seeing some no's. Correct, no, we don't. Why? Because prior approval is not needed to carry forward unobligated balances from year to year when there's no exception to it in the agreement. It's a small enough amount that the feds aren't going to question it, and we already have the prior approval via uniform guidance, FDP, and expanded authorities. Dr. Yellow is a PI on an NSF grant with Cornell COI, Dr. Malo, and UC Boulder COI, Dr. Marmot. So Cornell has given a sub award to UC Boulder, and Cornell COI, Dr. Malo, will be disengaging from the project for 6 months in order to focus on a project that needs all their time and energy. Dr. Malo will be returning to the project after that 6 months. Do we need prior approval for Dr. Malo's disengagement?
Yes.
Yes, more than 3 months. Yes, 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 yes is the answer. Why? NSF requires that prior approval for all PIs, PDs, co-PIs, co-PDs, disengagement more than 3 months. All right, y'all are rocking it. And that's all that I have. So any questions, comments, and concerns, please go ahead, unmute, and let me know.
Hi, Liz.
Hey.
Hi, how are you doing? It's Karen Workman. I'm sorry if I missed this, having a little technical issues earlier.
Oh, no.
Is it still the case that NSF, that it is the program officer that has authority for the rebudgeting of participant support?
That is a good question. I am not an NSF expert. Jamie is shaking her head and she's going to unmute.
Yeah, the answer is no. So like Liz had spoken to, the program officers can be excellent partners in working through some of these prior approval requirements. Depending on their involvement at the sponsor level, they may have more say than others. But in general, it doesn't, ultimate authority does not lie with the program officer, right? A lot of approvals have to go through the program officer before they go to the contracting officer, but the contracting officer or grants officer is going to have that final say. So while there is some level of approval, it is likely not final approval. Does that make sense?
Sure, yeah. I just, my prior experience with NSF and with the PAP was that, at least previously, that the authority rested with the program officer with regard to participant support changes.
I mean, I think a lot of the determination as to whether they're going to approve it or not is going to be up to the program officer. But if it doesn't pass the smell test from a grants officer perspective at NSF, the grants officer is not going to let it through.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, so also when you're thinking about this, it's like who's authorized to sign off on an amendment is also what it comes down to. So program officers are generally not AORs. They don't have the authorization to sign any amendments. So like Jamie said, they could be super influential and help make that decision and maybe even be the final like key decision maker, but they can't sign anything that says otherwise. It's just like a PI here. You know, when you have a question from a subaward when it comes to a programmatic or budget change, the PI says yes or no, and it's really their determination because it's their project. They can't sign for it. You know, the your GCO or your sub-award officer has to sign for that. So also think about it in that way. Excellent question.
There's another question in chat that I'll read to you, Liz. So if an NSF award starts on 9/1, or actually I'm going to modify this question. If any award, federal award starts on 9/1, can a fall GRA be appointed with the idea that they would need 10 days of pre-award?
I mean, technically, yeah, because it falls within the pre-award spending, but I'd really take a look at that and see, if, they are working on that project 10 days before, because that's where it really comes into play. If they're starting work on that project on 9/1, it's not appropriate to put salary on that project for those 10 days. It might just be easiest and cleanest and most auditable to put those 10 days on a department account and then start the work on 9/1 when the work is actually supposed to start. So it's really technically yes, but I would take a further look into it to really see if that is the most appropriate thing to do based on how the work is being performed.
Yeah, and again, to Liz's slide with the pyramid, right? You still have to look at the award document, because there are absolutely situations that we get where we get a federal grant that are made under the expanded authorities, except you read the award document itself and it says that pre-award is not allowed. So do be careful with that one, because that's where we can get in a little bit of trouble and we can end up in a situation where we have to go ahead and cover some costs internally and not charge those to the sponsor. One more note I'll make about pre-award. This is calendar days. So depending on the number of days in the month in which you're counting backwards, it may not be, starting on the 1st of March is your pre-award start for 90 days, right? It might actually be March 3rd. So watch out for that. I've seen that a couple people get caught by that before. If you Google a date calculator, you can actually do the math with 90 days really quick with a couple of tools online, but double check that as well. Karen, I see that you've unmuted yourself. Do you have another question?
Yeah, and I unmuted myself. I had the question, Jamie, and then my 60-year-old brain completely lost track of what I wanted to say.
My younger one did the same thing when I was trying to make a grocery list this morning. So you're in good company.
Okay, so here it is. I remember it. Thank you. Pre-award beyond 90 days. The default is 90 days. I remember again dealing with NSF. If we want pre-award costs, this was at proposal stage.
Mm-hmm.
If we anticipate pre-award costs prior to the 90 days, it has to be included in the proposal or they will not allow it. Is that still the case?
No, that's not still the case because of the changes to uniform guidance, FDP, and the expanded authorities. It's really going to be written to your agreement, and NSF does allow the 90-day pre-award spending without prior approval, again, unless otherwise stated. If you kind of know when you're looking at like a weirdo NSF program announcement, they usually say as well, what applies and what doesn't apply. But if it's like a standard NSF, we have that automatic approval for the most part, and you usually get notified that your PI gets notified at least that this passed with a high score, we're expecting funding and all that good stuff. Again, it's at risk to the department, but no, you don't have to include it as part of the proposal.
Up to the 90 days, correct, Liz?
Correct, yeah. Anything past the 90 days, it is a good idea to include in the proposal with a justification as to why. And I would communicate with your program officer on your needs on that. If you do pass the review phase or are expected to get that agreement. As well as making sure that whoever the GMS is for your project is aware and looping them in as needed, up to that. So we have all that documentation in there.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and just one small point of clarification. Even if you ask for for pre-award spending of over 90 days in your proposal, that doesn't mean that it's automatically approved. We would still have to go through the process at award stages confirming that that was actually allowed. And I would say 9 times out of 10, we would be still submitting a prior approval request to get that in writing. This does happen. Typically where I see it happen is situations where we need to purchase equipment way ahead of time because there's such a large lead time for getting that equipment in the door, usually manufactured. So it does happen. When it happens, call your GCO. We can help you through it. I don't see any more questions in chat, but I do see, there was somebody who was unmuted. Oh, Betsy Collins, you're unmuted. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so is the procedure for rebudgeting participant support costs to get the program officer approval and then to send that to our GCO here to, or,
No, so any prior approval request, please send to your GCO first. Put it in RAS,
okay.
get it into the system. Your GCO is going to review that to see, one, if we do need to ask for prior approval or if it's something that is automatically approved. And two, we know how to work the system. You know, we know which people to contact. We know who's going to be the most appropriate contacts for all that stuff. And we know kind of how to craft these statements to make it look the best. If it's something like, if your PI is just like, yeah, I just started need this, like blah, blah, blah. And you're like, that's not really a good justification. I don't think we should say that to the sponsor kind of thing. You know, crafting those statements, making sure we have all the right documentation, making sure our I's are crossed, our T's are dotted, all that good stuff. Always on any prior approval request, please let your GCO communicate with the sponsor. There's very rare occasions where the PI is the one that communicates with the sponsor. For Fed stuff, GCO as much as possible.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and one comment I'll make about sort of this whole thing that we're talking about here, because it's come up recently too. Keep in mind that when you have a subrecipient underneath a Cornell award, if they have a prior approval request that is being dictated by that lead sponsor, they need to make that request to us, and then we need to make that request up to the sponsor. So the example that we've had a lot recently is actually participant support costs. So if a subrecipient wants to rebudget out of participant support, they need to come to us, and then we need to file that request up to NSF, right? So it's got to flow up, and then the approval is going to flow back down as well again. So if you're not sure how to navigate that situation, again, contact the GCO. We can work with the sub-award team and help you navigate that whole process. But keep in mind, it still has to come through us and the prime sponsor before we can actually approve it. It looks like we're almost at time, but I wanted to make sure there's not any other questions for Liz. I don't see any more.
Don't see any more. No. Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, everybody, for attending. And we will see you next month. We're going to have Bridget talk about RCR. So we look forward to seeing everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.